Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into this from home. My name's Maddison and I'm a research scientist in the Agriculture Division of the Department of Primary Industries and Resources up here in the Northern Territory. I'm really excited today to share you some of the work that I've been doing on mangoes. So if you didn't know, mangoes are the Northern Territory's largest horticultural product, and the NT is also the largest producer of mangoes in Australia. So they've got quite a substantial local and national value. So the title of my talk today is Food for Our Future. And I've chosen to talk to you about this project today because it's working on ensuring that we have a sustainable production of mangoes for the NT for many years to come. I hope you enjoy. Thanks. So these are mango flowers. Since 2016, my colleagues and I have been studying mango flowers. What we've been doing is observing the fate of new stems on mango trees from the start of the dry season all the way to the start of the wet season. And by doing that, we're able to pinpoint the exact moments in time where stems turn into flowers as they're growing instead of leaves. We're then able to investigate the environmental conditions at that time and identify what environmental cues triggered flowering. So this project formed the basis of an impact assessment that we've been working on with the National Environmental Science Program. And that impact assessment will be published later in the year, and it aims to identify if there will be an impact of a changing climate on the way that mangoes flower in the top end now. So today I want to explore a bit more about how mangoes flower and the things that we've found in regards to mango flowering up here. I'd like to cover a bit about the impacts that we have been able to identify so far. And I'd also like to just quickly run through a couple of ways that we can start working towards adapting our farming systems to climate change. So first up, how do mangoes flower? So mango flowering occurs when we achieve a balance of several factors. So those factors have to come into alignment all at the same time for mango flowering to occur. Now the first is the growth stage or the stage of development. So the stems on mango trees must be at the right stage of development to be receptive to environmental cues for flowering. So in mangoes, this usually occurs after a period of leafy or vegetative growth. So new leaves are produced, and then there's a period of inactivity or dormancy. So during that period, the leaves go into a rest state and they mature, and we observe maturity by leaves being hard and crunchy and a dark green colour. So you can see there the highlighted area on the flow chart is where that starts to happen at the beginning. Then bud initiation can happen, which is a new bud starting to grow. And if the temperatures are right at that time, then those buds will turn into flowers. So the next is temperature change. So we know in the top end that we're getting a change of temperature at the start of the dry, and that's when mango flowering starts. So it's those cool temperatures that is needed around the time of bud growth with those mature leaves to get mango flowering. So the buds need to be ready to grow. If they're dormant for whatever reason, or if they don't have access to the resources, nutrients and water they need to grow, then they won't be able to start growing and therefore transition into a flower. And this is a really common management practice up here in the top end. So if resources are mildly limited, flowering tends to be more successful. So if there's an oversupply of resources like water and nutrients to the tree, it won't need to flower as much. So a very common management practice is to limit those resources slightly to get a more successful flowering. So there's another very important factor in regards to successful mango flowering, and that is the influence of cultivar-specific genetics. So there are various traits that differ from cultivar to cultivar, but the most important in regards to mango flowering is the sensitivity to temperature. Now some cultivars are more sensitive to warm temperatures when flowering than others. So we measure this by comparing the response of different cultivars to temperature, to different temperatures, a whole range of temperatures. So those that flower at higher temperatures have a lower sensitivity to temperature. And we call that, when we're measuring that, we call them temperature thresholds. So each cultivar has different temperature thresholds, and they'll have different minimum and maximum temperature thresholds. So what's interesting is we haven't yet considered that trait or that condition when we are breeding new cultivars of mango. So generally we don't know what those temperature thresholds will be for most new cultivars until we get them into a production setting, and we just see how they perform. So in regards to adaptability to a changing climate, that will be an important consideration for if we're ever developing new cultivars of mango. So to dive a little deeper into the temperature triggers for flowering, we can analyse seasonal changes to better understand, but also to possibly predict when flowering will occur in different regions. So on this graph here, I've got maximum temperatures up the top with the solid lines and minimum temperatures down the bottom with the dotted lines. And I've averaged northern and southern production regions around Australia. So we know that the arrival of the dry season here and the arrival of winter elsewhere should trigger flowering, and in most cases that does occur. So it happens up here right at the beginning of the dry when we start getting cool temperatures. However, the response of mango buds to temperature is a little more complex than that. So it's important to consider that complexity if you are a producer, but also if you are measuring the impact of climate change. So in identifying thresholds for flowering, we've managed to identify that there's probably 4 different thresholds. They're not all important all the time. It depends on the region and the cultivar, but there could potentially be 4. So those 4 are the upper and lower limits of maximum and minimum temperatures. So the daytime temperatures and nighttime temperatures, and then there's a range in which those temperatures are suitable or not suitable for mango flowering. So we know that in the territory, potentially only 2 of those thresholds are relevant, and that's because we don't get cold temperatures here. So our temperatures don't actually reach the lower limits of minimum and maximum temperatures. So that's really cold temperatures overnight and then cold daytime temperatures. But as you can assume, there's many other production areas that are getting to those conditions, and in those cases, mango trees usually enter a period of dormancy. So we think that probably happens when minimum temperatures are below 12 degrees and when maximum temperatures are below 18 to 20. So what happens then is it's not only too cold for flowering, but it's actually too cold for the tree to grow at all. So we're not actually getting that new bud growth. So there's no opportunity for buds to turn into flowers. So as you can imagine, that probably happens in most regions around Australia in winter. So what the way that differentiates flowering here from flowering in southern regions is that the flowering events actually occur later in the year. So we can see that we've got those sort of bands where flowering can occur. We know in the northern regions, the maximum temperatures are only dropping down below that maximum temperature threshold for a short period of time. So that's quite a limiting threshold for the territory at least. But then you can also see that the minimum temperatures for the northern regions is in that ideal temperature range for a bit longer. And that happens earlier in the year. Whereas the southern regions, both their maximum and minimum temperatures don't enter those threshold ranges until a bit later in the year. And that's why we get northern production regions flowering earlier and southern flowering regions flowering, mango regions flowering later. That also dictates harvest timing as well. So that's why we get production throughout, a good portion of the year, but it's spread. I also want to note here that I've presented monthly average temperatures in this graph, and that's just to demonstrate to you the difference between northern and southern regions. But if we were looking at this really closely and really wanted to identify when flowering would occur, it's important to use daily measured temperature. So you can look at a last season's temperature record and the daily maximum and minimums to do a similar assessment to this. The reason why it's important to use daily records instead of monthly averages is because there could be a short period of time when the conditions are suitable for mango flowering and flowering can occur. But if that's balanced out by, the remainder of a month being too warm for flowering, averaging that would hide that dip in temperatures where flowering has occurred. So it's important to look at their daily detail, because it can only take, it can take several days for flowering to occur. But if there's 7 days and flowering has occurred, but the rest of the month is higher, you won't see those 7 days. On to measuring the impacts of climate change. So what do we know? We know that temperatures are going to rise, and we know that rising temperatures will affect both maximum and minimum temperatures up here in the top end. We also know that those changes will be different spatially. So it will be important in an assessment of impacts to do a spatial or regional assessment. We already know that climates are quite different across the top end. We don't have as big of a gradient as some other states, but we know in regards to mango flowering, just from observations, that we're getting differences in flowering across the production regions in Darwin and then compared to Katherine as well. So how do we measure that impact? So what we've done is we've counted the number of days where flowering can occur historically, and then we've gone out into the field and measured the proportion of stems that have turned into flowers compared to the proportion that have turned into leaves. So from that, we're able to develop a positive linear model, and then we can use that positive linear model to take the number of days that occur in the climate models, projections into the future, the number of days in which flowering can occur in those models, and relate that back to the potential proportion of flowering that we're going to get here into the future. So I've got one example of that. So this is the number of days in July below 18 degrees overnight, so that's minimum temperature. The first point on the graph there is what we call recent or historical. It's not really current. We're already essentially moved into that 2030 point because the 2030 and all of those other years on there actually represent a 30-year period in time. So those, so we're already well and truly into the 2030 point. But the conditions that we're used to seeing in the past are probably represented by what's on the first point in the graph. So this is for the Greater Darwin region, so that includes production regions like Berry Springs and Bachelor and Maracay. And you can see that on the first point, we're sitting at about 20 to 25 days in July with minimum temperatures below 18. So that's quite a lot. Then I've represented two RCPs, so two emission scenarios. So they're two different ways in which we are contributing to a change in climate. Now RCP 4.5 is a low emission scenario and RCP 8.5 is a higher emission scenario. And you can see that there is quite a different effect from both of those emission scenarios on the graph. So we're starting at 20 to 25 days. By the end of the century, getting down to between 5 and 15 days below 18 in July. So it's quite a significant change, particularly with RCP 8.5. There's quite a steep slope in that change, so it happens relatively rapidly. And I've used days below 18 in July because I know for most of us, that kind of resonates as those cool nights, lovely cool nights throughout the dry season. So it's sort of more tangible to understand the impact that this will have when we can understand how it will make us feel. So, July will certainly be quite a bit hotter. So then we use that and translate it into this graph based on that linear model that I mentioned earlier. So this is the percentage of terminals, so percentage of stems that have turned into flowers instead of leaves, and across the same time series. So I've just translated the data. So we've got very similar trends here, but now we can see that we're starting at about 32% potential flowering in the Greater Darwin region, which is already quite low, and then moving by the end of the century down to somewhere between 28 and 20. So this only considers the one threshold. So remember, we've still got plenty of other thresholds that have to align at the same time for flowering to occur successfully. And then there's a range of those other factors that I mentioned right at the beginning as well that we need for mango flowering to occur. So this is just one little example, but it gives you a snippet of the types of change that we can project will occur based on the information that we have now. So why is all of this important? Well, flowering translates directly to the volume of fruit, right? So if you have a really big flowering event, we can get more fruit. Doesn't necessarily mean that we do, because there's a lot of other factors that need to align after that. But the more flowers, the more potential there is for more fruit. Flowering also, the timing of flowering also dictates the timing of harvest. There are a couple of other factors in there as well that can change the timing of harvest, but it's pretty well consistent that the harvest occurs, approximately 90 days after a flowering event. So that's really important, because if that's going to change, which it very well could, if the occurrence of those cool temperatures shifts, or if we're getting less and they're getting more contracted to a particular time, then harvest timing could change, and that's important because it dictates market access and also potentially price as well. There are many other mechanisms in mango production that are temperature sensitive. So it will be also important in future impact assessments to consider these. Things like pollen viability and the architecture of flowers, so the way that they are formed that allows them to be fertilized and turn into fruit. Mango production, as I mentioned earlier on, is very valuable to the NT and also nationally, but it's also valuable globally. So the Australian mango industry is actually quite small compared to a lot of other production industries across the world. And there are a lot of communities globally that are relying on those industries. So you imagine tropical communities throughout the world where majority of the world's mangoes are grown will also need to be sustained so that the livelihoods of the people in those communities can be sustained as well. So this information is going to be quite valuable to the global mango industry. So what can we do to make sure that our mango industries remain sustainable when the climate changes? And these things I've tried to make them relatively general, so they also apply to other industries as well. So if you are a mango grower or any other grower, in this particular example, please read our impact assessment. So that will be published later on in the year. I'm very happy to send you a copy of it as soon as it comes out if you get in touch with me, but it will also be published on our website, so the Department of Primary Industries website, and also on NEST's website. So you can find the NEST site by just Googling NESP, Mango, Northern Territory, and it will come up straight away. So there'll be a really in-depth analysis of our impact assessment, including a background of the climate science and the science around flowering as well. There'll also be a significant portion of that report on adaptation and mechanisms like I'm talking about now for ensuring that production remains sustainable. And If you don't have time or you're sort of not interested in reading that big report, there is of course a summary report, and there'll be a bunch of fact sheets about how to apply that information to a production system if you're a grower. Access climate information for your region. So anyone can do this, and I'll put some links on in a moment. So there's lots of online resources now for having quite a detailed look at a specific region, and what is projected to change, and how and to what degree those things are projected to change. So all sorts of climate variables. We've only spoken about temperature here, but there's obviously projections about all climate variables. So that's really important. Have an understanding of what might happen, and when, so we can look at timing as well of that change. Incorporate that information into a long-term plan. So if it is revealed that in fact those changes that you've identified by accessing climate information could potentially impact your operation, incorporate something into your plan to improve resilience. Now there'll be, as I said, lots of options discussed in the impact assessment, but the first thing, for example, could be accessing the climate information and learning more about climate science and developing your understanding of it. And then identifying ways to incorporate that into a longer term plan. So that could be like doing an assessment as to how sustainable your current mango cultivar is in production in the region that you're in at the moment. And then identifying at what stage your production might become vulnerable, because it might not be for 50 years, and then you've got plenty of time to develop a longer term plan depending on how you'd like to adapt to that. So these the two links here. So really good one for accessing climate information is climatechangeinaustralia.gov.au. There's lots of background information there and explanations as to what all of the data is. It's a great place to start. And then there's a link to the NESP site as well, which has a lot of information about our project, and that's where the final impact assessment will be published, as well as our site. And also contact me, get in touch with me. I'm very happy to talk about this in more depth, answer any specific questions that you have maybe about your particular production region. I've got lots of data now relevant to the NT, so very happy to supply you with some data, and I'll put my contact details on the last slide. So what if you just love mangoes and love all of the other Northern Territory produced food, and you want to support our growers? What can you do? Share what you've learned here today. So continue this discussion with everyone you know about the sustainability of our locally produced food and how climate change works into that. Buy local, support Northern Territory growers where possible. I know you can't get everything up here, but by doing that, you're allowing our local growers to build their operations, continue to build their operations, and enabling them to make the changes that they need to remain sustainable well into the future. And you're also investing back into the territory, which is great too. And have discussions about climate change. If you can, specifically about food production and sustainability and how the climate impacts that. But one of the biggest barriers to adapting to climate change is education and awareness. So please share information, good sources of information, and talk about climate change where you can. And it's important in the territory to get access to climate change information that is relevant here, rather than projecting information from elsewhere. So, we've got quite a unique climate here and unique conditions, so it's important to access really quality local information. So that's all for me. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it wasn't too sciencey for you. So thank you very much.